could I say something very, very briefly in there if I can? I think some of the great work that was done also was the differentiation between your large and your small to medium suppliers and being able to ask relevant questions to the different cohorts. Because one of the things that frustrates me is I feel sometimes like we're all passing that piece of paper to the left, if that makes sense, to ask those questions. And when you're asking really sophisticated questions of the small to medium supplier, they've got no idea what you're talking about. So I know that some of the work, particularly that we did, and we worked very hard with Seb and Tanya on this, but we really refined this, Jason, was to actually try to make sure that we're asking relevant questions to the right stakeholder size or the supplier size. So just a really important call out, I think. And in fact, that could be another event itself, I think, just because it's really important to be able to engage with suppliers at a different size in a meaningful way.
Yeah, exactly. And we have a lot of small suppliers as well. So it was crucial that we made sure we had the right level of comms. I think on the left-hand side, apologies for the colours, but the oranges and the dark reds are where we needed some significant improvement. And then on the right-hand side is our latest assessment, where you can still see there's a lot of blue. So obviously we've done really well. We've got a lot of greens and a few purples in there. But from my perspective, if you look at that procurement policy and strategy column, I still think there's a lot of improvement there. So while we're sitting at, a good metric, I still think we're doing really well, but I'm conscious that there's still a lot of work to do.
Just as a side note, we changed our colours because our clients find it very confrontational to just see pages of red. So we wanted them to absorb the areas of priority without being so confronted and that everything was burning.
No, it's good. It's all good. Sorry, Catherine, for eating up your time.
No, we might have to call that another masterclass, sustainability communications for procurement, because that's a huge part as well. But thank you for sharing that. I just wanted to say, if you look at 2021 to 2024, it's actually not a huge amount of time, in 3 years to look at some of those areas where it's sitting at a level 1 to then be level 4. That's pretty incredible when you've seen organisations that have been on the same journey for 10 years and we don't get that far. So thank you both for kind of sharing that. The other thing I was really glad that you touched on, and again, probably a masterclass in itself, is around engaging with suppliers and particularly the small to medium suppliers. And with that, I wanted to say our next speaker, if you wanted to talk about engaging with suppliers, she is your woman. She has spent an incredible amount of time deep in supplier engagement, from auditing all the way through. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Catherine from Lion. And if I can find her, I will spotlight her for you so you can actually see her.
So you'll find me. Great to see so many procurement professionals today. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation where I'm joining from today. I'm Catherine Alves, the Sustainability Specialist at Lion. I have been with Lion for 15 years and throughout have worked with suppliers in some capacity. So starting in quality, then procurement, and now within sustainability. Prior to Lion, I worked in the alcohol and coffee industry. And thank you for inviting Lion to present. I really enjoyed hearing from Tanya, Seb, Nick, and Jason today. Jason, some of that procurement information looked very similar in terms of processes, so it's great to see. So you may be wondering, who is Lion? It's a leading beverage company headquartered in Sydney with a history of over 180 years. Our business span beer, cider, wine, seltzers, spirits, and other categories, including coffee. It's known for its commitment to quality, community, and sustainability, and became Australasia's first large-scale carbon neutral brewer. So you can see that it started in 1840 in New Zealand. The core beer portfolio includes many loved brands in Australia and New Zealand. So we can go to, that one. So one of the largest brewers in Australia, with brands including Forex, Hahn and Tooheys, as well as craft brands such as Stone and Wood, Little Creatures. Tooheys dates back over 150 years. Forex celebrated 100 years. And Furphy will again be the official beer of the Melbourne Cup next week. I'm looking forward to that. Other line craft beer includes Fixation, White Rabbit, Kosciuszko, and Yamundi. Can jump to the next slide. The Vanguard luxury brands include award-winning Four Pillars. If you haven't tried it, you should. Vodka, whiskey, including the Australian Whiskey Morris and tequila. We can jump to the New Zealand brands. So we do have RTDs in New Zealand. New Zealand is the largest alcoholic beverage company, which includes brands like Stein Lager, Max, Spates, Emerson's, Panhead, and a portfolio of wine brands, including Still and Sparkling from our Wither Hills vineyard. Here in the United States, we've got New Belgium Brewing, we've got Bell's Brewing, and wineries in Napa Valley. So those brands include Fat Tire, Voodoo Ranger, Textbook, and Markham. I haven't tried all of them yet, so I have to do that. So if we jump to the next slide, yes, line operations. We have 33 manufacturing sites. As I mentioned, headquartered in Sydney. We also operate hospitality venues in Australia, New Zealand, and the US. Employ approximately 3,000 people, a little bit more. And the largest sites being Tooheys in Sydney, Forex in Brisbane, and the Pride Brewery in Auckland, East Tamaki. And Line also has a coffee roastery in New Zealand. So if we look at the ESG strategy, so Line's purpose, our sustainability strategies under the environmental social governance framework. It's a force for good philosophy, which aligns with Line's purpose of making the moment mean more. Today, we are looking at the social pillar all along the right. So it's the diverse and ethical supply chain. Line is committed to a transparent, ethical and diverse supply chain that extends to uphold business ethics, implementing sustainable practices and respecting the human rights of those in our supply chain. We do rely on thousands of suppliers to support our manufacturing and business operations. So we recognise that our actions of our suppliers and our interactions with them can support Line's efforts to drive positive social, environmental and economic outcomes in the community in which we live and work. You can jump to the next slide. So we acknowledge that our business activities, including our operations and our supply chain, could cause, contribute, or be likely linked to modern slavery. So despite the inherent risk of our modern slavery existing in our operations being low, we have control mechanisms in place to mitigate potential risk and ensure Line is a fair, safe and inclusive workplace. How we identify and address risks starts with our policies, governance mechanisms, training, our own site's due diligence, which includes self-assessments, and most recently an audit for ourselves. And finally, our responsible sourcing program, which I'm going to jump into talking about now. So the Line procurement policy and the supplier responsible sourcing code underpin our procurement practices and set the minimum expectations of our suppliers. In 2023, we published our human rights policy, which sets out our human rights commitments across our global organisations. As an integral part of our value chain, we expect that our suppliers and business partners adhere to this policy through their own contractual agreements. All our suppliers are required to abide by Line's responsible sourcing code, and it sets the expectations of our suppliers and their subsequent suppliers in providing goods and services to Line, and support suppliers to identify, mitigate and manage their sustainability, which include environmental, social, human rights and modern slavery governance risks. Line takes a risk-based approach to managing our suppliers within our responsible sourcing program, which I'll go through in further details in the next slide. You can, yes, our footprint, our supplier footprint. So I did mention we do have over 1,000 suppliers coming in from 33 different countries. This was last year's information. 97% of that is actually from Australia and New Zealand. producing beer, one of the main ingredients is the raw ingredients that go into the beer. So they are usually local. Most spend is direct materials, and then it goes into indirect materials and services. So you can go to the next slide. So I did mention that our inherent risk for modern slavery in our supply chain is deemed low. That's referring to the Global Slavery Index. But we have identified the following commodities to be a high inherent risk for lying globally. So what you can see there is coffee, fruit and harvesting, contracted labour, uniforms and promotional items, PPE and IT equipment. And this is due to the risk factors listed, such as the geographies they're in, the work hours, the known use of child labour, and the low skilled workers, just some examples. Obviously, there's more. So we're jumping into, I guess, the responsible sourcing program itself. So underpinning that is our supplier risk segmentation. So the segmentation determines the level of modern slavery risk attributed to each supplier in Tier 1 of our supply chain, and it is conducted annually. In 2023, incorporated the 3,000 suppliers that we use across Australia, New Zealand and US. Through our responsible sourcing program, we work with our suppliers to identify, mitigate and manage their ethical, environmental, labour relations and human rights risks to meet, probably more importantly, our stakeholder expectations. So what we uphold and also what our customers uphold. The supplier risk segmentation methodology enables lines to prioritise suppliers for further action, identifying which suppliers have a high likelihood of the given supply chain risks being presented within their business and the impact it may have. The risk segmentation methodology and associated heat map, which you can see on the left, classifies suppliers according to priority. So we have highest, high, moderate, and minimum based on likelihood and consequence. There is a matrix behind this, a bit like bingo in terms of numbers. So the model actually utilises external benchmarking data to assess the level of modern slavery risk associated with each supplier. So they include lists of goods produced using child labour or forced labour, trafficking in persons report, researching commodities worldwide, the Global Slavery Index, global estimates of modern slavery, so from the International Labour Organization, the Atlas method rankings, and Global Rights Index. The resulting segmentation, which comes out there, informs how we manage and then monitor compliance within the program, and allows us to focus resource where there is a greater risk of labour or human rights violations. So on the right, you can see that this can include asking suppliers to complete a self-assessment questionnaire, being part of training webinars. We send out our modern slavery training every year to our suppliers, and if needed, requesting an ethical audit to be conducted by a third party. We work closely with our highest and high priority suppliers. You can see there's about 3%, and we work together on specific programs where needed for better transparency, especially leading into our Tier 2 suppliers. We have, I would say, great suppliers that support us in this, very forthcoming, and work well with us. So it's good to see. We do have suppliers on the end which ask why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about modern slavery in Australia? But eventually, after we do talk to those suppliers, they come around and, you know, are really surprised that this does happen in Australia for us. And so we need to really make sure we're looking at that and making sure our suppliers know as well. So that's probably the main points there. I'm happy to catch up with anyone who'd like to find out more on this, but it's been going for about 4 years at Line, our responsible sourcing program, and obviously our modern slavery statement has a lot of that information in there as well if you need to know more details. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Catherine. You can see that there's an incredible amount of work that's gone into that program over the last few years. There's also lucky to have been involved in the early days as well. So if you have any questions for Catherine, please reach out directly as well, and the same goes for all our speakers. But we do have a little bit of time now, so I thought I'll take a little bit of a pause and see if there's any questions that anyone has for our speakers or for Nicola or myself. Feel free to drop it into the chat or pop your hand up. While we're waiting, I actually have one, if that's okay, while we're waiting for some to come through. And I guess, you know, thinking about the self-assessment that we just went through, and Nick, your comment as well around integrating KPIs into your executive team scorecards and STI, and obviously that's, you know, where a lot of the initial parts of the ISO20400 assessment asks, you know, is it integrated into policy, into stakeholder roles and responsibilities? I think that's something that a lot of us have struggled with in procurement roles. I know certainly in my past roles I have as well, is, you know, how do you get that sort of top-down agreement, and how do you start to build that into things like STIs? And obviously there's a few more drivers that are coming into play. Legislation is awfully helpful in some instances, but I just thought I'd ask, you know, a question for the whole panel. You know, how have you been successful in getting that, you know, recognition from the top down, and are there any you know, are there any actions that we can take to sort of help move us along in that journey?
Did you want to go first, Tanya?
Sure. I was going to let you, but otherwise we'll waste too much time. So I think, first of all, procurement, we know as a function, we are effectively everyone's our customer, internal or external. So using the language and aligning with the sustainability goals, targets, and using the value-based focus areas, particularly the materiality assessment. So what is material at the organisational level, and then being proactive, not sitting there waiting for the sustainability team or now the CFO and the financial team or the risk team that are going to come to you going, where's my data for my financial external assured reporting? Actually taking the time to be able to match material organisational risks to material risks around categories, commodities, and integrating that into strategies. We are often so focused on what we need to do right now that we're not proactive enough, anticipating our internal customers' needs and using their language.
I might just add to that just a little bit, Tanya. I think that the decision that we made to use the ISO standard as the metric, I guess, for the organisation was based initially not on just simplicity, but just on trying to make sure that we knew that this was the foundational work that we needed to do to be able to drive the outcomes underneath that. So that included our Scope 3 emissions reporting, and we were talking about that even before the ASRS stuff that we're talking about now, but also obviously modern slavery compliance and other elements as well. So I think what's really important is that we wanted to have something that was tangible and measurable. And we were lucky, and I think that most businesses now have a much more engaged executive team. So it's not like we're trying to beg executives to do this. In fact, now they're coming to us and pushing it down onto us. It's a complete reversal of what was happening 10 years ago, which is it's a great thing, but it's a different set of challenges. So being able to sit down, I think, get your ducks lined up, go there with a really tangible plan about what the metric is and how you need to achieve that is actually really critical to being able to get success, because the CFO doesn't want to sign off on a metric for his STI that you're not going to hit or that you may be going to hit, just saying. And so, but what that also does is that actually then lends the support from the business and puts that behind you when you're actually going and making sure that you're delivering on that project, because it is then attached to the STIs. Another thing that we did was the business had a balanced scorecard, and that was a really important inclusion. We had sustainability metrics within that. We had one about recovery rates over at bingo. We had one around the ISO, actually, the implementation of the 20400, and one around the carbon work that I was doing as well. So I managed to really sort of build in those metrics into the balanced scorecard, and that applied to everyone across the business as the gateway. So I think it's really important to be able to sort of be very clear when you're approaching your executives on what the metric is and how you're going to achieve it, and you will get that immediate buy-in.
Yeah, very good takeaways. We do have a couple of questions in the chat as well. One from Andrew, which, Catherine, I might throw over to you first, given Lion's kind of reach and footprint, is that, it's a challenge understanding what, sustainable supply chains look like in some of our overseas countries. So, how do we understand more about what sustainability looks like for some of our international suppliers? What's the best way that we might look to go about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Andrew, and definitely a challenge for a lot of companies. So you're not alone. What I would say is that you need to be very specific with your suppliers in your expectations, and have that in contractual agreements, because it's very hard to ask them for something if they didn't need to supply that before. So maybe start looking at your contracts and your policies, and then once you do have that in place and they've agreed to that, then really make it clear what your expectations are so that you can actually have something to go with them to talk about. It's not as much as a challenge for Lion, but it is definitely a challenge for some of our suppliers. And there are certain countries that they find challenging in terms of what they will give them. So they've actually gone down that avenue of being very specific, and it seems to be helping them.
Makes a lot of sense. And Tanya, do you want to add to that?
Just very quickly, and Catherine is absolutely on the money. Specificity, being clear around what you're asking, clarity in when you're asking, questionnaires year after year is nowhere near as powerful as asking as a part of your due diligence process before you actually contract them. But I think the other thing is around if you're asking, for example, modern slavery or anti-modern slavery practices, and as I popped in the chat, don't ask for things that you're not going to review. And if you're not going to review it, you also need to review the efficacy of what they have in place. So don't ask for things that you're not going to use. And secondly, don't have a myopic view on, I'm just looking at modern slavery, because if we can relieve the burden and integrate sustainability topics from that initial contact when it comes to the supply, that's going to be really helpful. If you're collecting questions around your suppliers, asking them about their next level of the supply chain immediately gives you visibility of tier 2 and potentially tier 3. And I think also lastly, I'm a big fan, and I have used global risk assessment tools where you integrate the supplier name or entity name. You can talk about the different countries in which it may have operations, the individuals as well, and you can get immediate responses around risk profiles and flags related to a really broad suite of sustainability topics, as well as your traditional risk management aspects. It is a bit of work to be able to manage tools and whatnot, but that's something that you can also use for ongoing, very handy for your audit team, very handy for your risk team. So it's broader than just sustainable procurement.
Can I just add one very quick thing? That's great, Tanya. That's perfect. But the one thing I will add, just as an added caveat to some of this, is that for Andrew's sake, I think it's really important to take a look at what your industry is doing. So when I was over at Telco, there was a Telco Alliance, this is an example, that actually went and did supplier assessments across different geographies, and we were able to use each other's audits effectively So it actually gave more traction across the telco together. Thanks, Tanya. And I think that's really important. So whatever industry you're in or you're sort of have the most exposure to, take a look, because I think that that industry work is really critical to be able to accelerate what you're trying to do.
And Nick, that gives me a very nice segue into the importance of collaboration. And you know, it's 11:59. I am going to wrap up now. Just, you know, this is exactly what the SPP was designed to do. It was designed to share knowledge, to build some of these networks, to encourage collaboration in the industry. So please hop across to the LinkedIn group. There's a very interesting chat in the chat, a question for Tanya, which I suspect is going to take a little while to answer. So we might throw that in the LinkedIn group. But also, so you know, thank you all for joining us on Friday morning. I know it's been a little bit of a longer time, but hopefully you found this really interesting. If you have any feedback, any thoughts around what you want the next masterclasses to be, please let us know. Again, pop things in the LinkedIn group. And finally, just a very big thank you to all of our speakers here today, Tanya, Jason, Nick, and Catherine. You've done a stellar job at explaining you know, kind of a simple but very expansive concept, which is sort of the foundation of everything sustainable procurement in a very short amount of time. I know we could have talked for hours, but you know, you've given us the sort of the intro, the how-to, and some really great case studies in how to bring it all together. And we've really appreciated that. So with that, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and weekend. Happy Diwali for some of you. Well, for everyone, actually. And, you know, hopefully we'll see you in the LinkedIn group and at our next events.
Thanks
Bye,
all.
everyone.
See ya.
Thanks,
Bye, everyone.
Thanks all.